The most important lessons that we have probably ever learned about the area of influence as well as storytelling have come from the work of Aristotle. Aristotle, more than 2,000 years ago, wrote books like Rhetoric and Poetics that transformed our understanding of how stories work, that allowed us a glimpse as to why people are so persuasive. Aristotle not only contributed so much to those fields, but also helped us understand philosophy in a whole new way. He was one of the fathers of modern science and brought us to understand the importance of observation and how we can learn so much from the world through the way in which we think. He really is one of the most important figures in human history. And today on the Changing Minds podcast, we are going to go back in time to understand Aristotle's life and work so that we can find the gems that came from the work that he did to help us to be able to transform the quality of our life. This is going to be an exceptional episode because it's about an exceptional human that lived more than 2,000 years ago. Let's get ready to go. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Changing Minds podcast. My name is Owen Fitzpatrick, and today we are going to be continuing our series into Greek philosophers, and we're going to be this time diving into the work of Aristotle. Now, what's interesting is last week we did Plato, and Plato was the student of Socrates. Aristotle is indeed the student of Plato. So I'm telling you, there was something in the water back there in Athens, starting in the Golden Age in the middle of the 5th century BC and right the way through to where Aristotle came to prominence around about the middle of the following century in the 4th century BC. Because Aristotle, Socrates, and Plato, the three of them are known to this day as being some of the most important philosophers of all time. And in many ways, some of the ideas that they stood for, the ideas they came up with, still stand the test of time so many years later. And Aristotle is no different. Aristotle has made a huge impact, not just in terms of philosophy, but also in terms of the way in which we think, and indeed in many areas of science as well. So today, we're going to be looking at Aristotle's life, but particularly we're going to be focusing on his ideas, his books, and trying to understand as much as we can about what he offers. Now, I'm going to be putting a specific lens more about the psychology and the importance and implications from a psychological perspective, because that's my area of domain. But there's lots of literature out there, lots of great books written about the work of Aristotle, and a lot of it is about some of the biology stuff that he worked on and some of the scientific stuff he worked on. So without any further ado, let's talk about Aristotle. So he was born around about 384 BC. And in his early life, he was born in Stagira in northern Greece. His father was called Nicomachean. He was a physician to the king of Macedon, or Macedon, as it's known. By the way, I'm going to butcher lots of Greek names. We'll just deal with it. But he exposed Aristotle to biology and medicine as a result of being the physician to the king of Macedon. He was orphaned young, so his father and mother sadly passed away, and he was raised by a guardian. And at 70 years old, he actually joined Plato's academy in Athens, where he studied for 20 years. So Plato had a huge influence on Aristotle, and Aristotle was one of his best students, apparently. He really took to it. He was super smart, asked brilliant questions, and really learned a massive amount while he studied with Plato. In his time at Plato's academy, which was between around about 367 and 347 BC, he studied metaphysics, he studied ethics, he studied politics under Plato, so learned all about Plato's Republic and all that sort of jazz. He did disagree with Plato's theory of forms. So Plato's theory of forms, just to remind you from the last episode, and if you haven't checked that out yet, make sure you do after this one. But Plato's theory of forms basically suggested that you have the material world and then the world of ideas, let's say. And in the world of ideas, you can have the perfect shape, for example. You can have the perfect square, whereas in the real world, that doesn't always appear. And in the real world, you can have examples of, let's say, justice, but in the idea world, you can have what justice actually means at its absolute best. The perfect concept of beauty, perfect concept of all that sort of stuff. And where Aristotle disagreed is he was much more about empirical observation. So it's less so about, a full disagreement, but he really emphasized the importance of empirical observation as opposed to idealism. So Aristotle was very much about observing what actually is and observing reality as we can perceive it, as opposed to finding yourself fixated upon these, inverted commas, ideal forms. So he was less likely to talk about how the philosophers will argue their way to enlightenment and much more about what we can discover if we observe. And that's why his work is so relevant from a scientific perspective. He left the academy after Plato's death, and soon, eventually, formed his own academy. So he spent a bit of time traveling. There was a lot of moving parts happening. Remember, this was after the Peloponnesian War. At this time, over the course of the next 50 years or so, initially Sparta got a good control over sort of Athens, or a good influence over it. Then there was more wars, and then Macedon started to rise to power with, I think, Philip II, his son, who most of us will know because he was a great guy. Clue, clue, clue. His name was Alexander the Great. Now, there is a nickname. If I ever want a nickname, if anyone ever, like, let's imagine, well, probably no one will remember me after I die, but let's imagine, hypothetically speaking, I'm dead 100 years, and people come across, dusty old archives of the internet, and they see my stuff, and they go, oh my goodness, he's, what's his name? Owen. It would be amazing if my nickname was Owen the Great. Who's that? Is that Owen? What's his name? Oh, I think it's Owen the Great. That is an epic nickname. If you ever want to, like Ivan the Terrible, he got a raw deal with Ivan the Terrible, right? That's kind of pretty much for the rest of history. People know you as Ivan the Terrible. I don't even know what Ivan the Terrible's second name is. And I don't know Alexander's second name. I just know it was the Great. So anyway, I'm just saying, if you're going to give me a nickname, I'm okay with the Great after my name, Owen the Great. Kind of has a ring to it, if you think about it. So whatever, I'll let you decide. But Aristotle became tutor to Alexander the Great, because remember, King of Macedon already sort of buddy with Aristotle's, father when he was alive. And therefore there was a connection there with family. So the King of Macedon turned around and said, listen, Ari, would you do me the honor of teaching my son? My son, his name is Alexander, when Alexander was young. And so in 343 BC, Aristotle started tutoring Alexander the Great. And look, I'm not saying Aristotle was the reason why Alexander became the Great, but it couldn't have hurt having such a wise person in your corner for them. After some time on his travels, Aristotle did return to Athens, and he founded the Lyceum, which was focused initially on empirical research, but it was like you have Plato's sort of academy. The Lyceum was like Aristotle's school, and he liked to talk while walking, which was leading to the name the Peripatetic school. And this was the way in which they like to learn is that you teach while walking around the ruins in Athens. Now, they're only ruins, but the Lyceum or remnants of the Lyceum are there, and it's very interesting to just spend some time in that area of where the Lyceum was, right? And just imagine Aristotle, all those hundreds of years or thousands of years ago, teaching by walking around the area. Absolutely fascinating stuff. He wrote extensively. He was very prolific. And despite that, unfortunately, a lot of his work has got lost over the years. But he wrote extensively on ethics, politics, logic, and science. And eventually, through his later years, he had to flee Athens due to anti-Macedonian or Macedonian sentiment after Alexander's death. So when Alexander the Great died, spoiler alert, there was an anti-Macedonian, because remember, he was great, but he also was like pretty prolific in terms of the amount of countries he took over. So people are not like, oh, I love Alexander. They were, well, when he was ruler, they were like, oh yeah, he's the great. Anyway, he eventually died in 322 BC and left behind a vast intellectual legacy in, as I said, 322 BC. So some of his most important books, probably the most important book of all, is called the Nicomachean Ethics. And this, I think it was called Nicomachean because that was, I think his son edited it or something. But he talked about, first of all, the ultimate goal in life is what was known as eudaimonia. And eudaimonia is about flourishing, right? Focusing on what is, focusing on being virtuous, being a good person, not just feeling happy, not just the hedonistic perspective or goal. So life is not about attaining pleasure. It's much more about living a good life, a virtuous life. He said that virtue is achieved through habitual practice. He talked about the golden mean, which was an interesting concept. He said, look, we want the balance between extremes. So if you have any virtue and it's too much on one side or the other, that's when it's problematic. So you might have super generous on one extreme, could be the most generous person in the world, but you could be a walkover. But on the flip side, if you're a total Scrooge and you're not generous at all, then you're not going to build any good relationships there. So the happy medium is, the golden mean is the perfect amount of a certain virtue. And that's what we're looking for. We don't want someone to be too much of anything. Moderation is the secret. And this balance leads to a good life. He also talks about the notion that happiness is pretty much accomplished by living virtuously, and character is actually built through habit. an action, not just knowledge, defines morality. So sometimes there was a notion in some philosophy that it's really about how you think and what you think about things. But actually, Aristotle was more about, no, it's what you do. The way you act matters. And I think that's a very, very important point. It's like emphasize the importance of the actions that we take. He wrote on politics as well, really looked at humans being social and political beings. He said that the best governments tend to balance individual freedom and community welfare. The middle class is essential for stability, and good leader is based upon virtue and justice, which I think all makes sense. And again, didn't really subscribe to the same philosopher king mentality that Plato suggested, although he did emphasize the importance of a leader demonstrating the kind of virtue which aligns pretty much with some parts of Plato's suggestion. In one of my favorite books of Aristotle's, I would actually say it's probably my favorite, Rhetoric, he talks about the pillars of persuasion, where he looks at ethos, logos, and pathos. I think next episode we'll dive into a number of different books on persuasion influence, and that's one of them, and we'll look a little bit more about that book. But ethos in a nutshell is how persuasive are you, like the credibility of the communicator or speaker. Logos is the logical argument, or how good you are at reasoning with evidence. And then pathos is your emotional appeal, how good you are at influencing people through the way in which you change their feelings. So once again, the book Rhetoric had lots of great stuff around rhetorical techniques and strategies, which are still used today by various different speakers to become as powerful and as effective as speakers they can be. And one of the best books ever written, quite honestly, on speaking as well as on influence and persuasion. And then from one of the best books there to one of the best books ever written on storytelling, his Poetics. Aristotle's Poetics looked at the power of art and storytelling. Remember, in the last episode, if you checked out the episode on Plato, if you haven't, remember, make sure you do. But if you haven't checked it out, one of the things that Plato said is he said, look, be wary of the storytellers, be wary of the poets, be wary of the artists. Can't trust them. Now, the same dude that did that, he was like writing ferocious amounts of stories about this guy called Socrates. So, it's like, do not be careful of those storytellers. Let me tell you a story about the storytellers. And, you got to look at Plato and go, all right, bro, come on. You think we're that stupid? He would have been right. But he did warn us against the storytellers. And Aristotle was turning around and said, well, actually, storytelling is wonderful. And stories reveal the truth. Stories are a phenomenal way of putting across important messages in a powerful way. He talked about the value of tragedy and being able to provide people with the experience of what is known as catharsis, which is helping us to experience this negative feeling that we have through the suffering of the characters. So when we experience a tragedy, it allows us to be able to experience in a safe, psychologically safe way, the pain that we experience as part of human nature. So he talked about how stories can provide us with the ability we need in order for us to be able to feel what we feel in a more vivid and powerful way. So he also talks about the story structure, clear beginning, middle, and end. He looks about the plot of the story, looks at the importance of the character. The hero should be relatable and flawed, so not perfect. He talks about the idea and themes should be meaningful, and there should be an overarching message to the stories. Again, looks at the melody, as he calls it, the rhythm and musicality of the storytelling, so the rhythm of the story as well, the visual effects of it, the way in which it's presented, the descriptiveness of it, the ways words are used as well. He really goes deep into the incredible world of storytelling, and he does it incredible justice. So Poetics is another classic, a phenomenal book. He also has other books about logic and a lot of books about science as well. Talks a lot about reasoning, a lot of the understandings we have today comes back to Aristotle, helping us understand the various different ways in which we use logical reasoning and how we're able to come to conclusions. And that was used in math, it was used in science, but it's also used in terms of persuasion as well. So Aristotle, full of wisdom when it comes to all this sort of stuff. One of his other theories that he talks about is known as the four causes. And he says, look, in order for us to be able to figure things out, a good tool that we can use is what he calls the four causes. And he says everything has four different types of causes. They have what we call the material cause. And this would be, let's imagine we say, what's the cause of a chair? We'd say the material would be wood, right? What's the cause of a human being? The material might be the DNA. Then we've got the formal cause, the second cause, and this would be the way it's formed. So the human being would be the body, right? That's another cause, the cause of the body shape. Or a chair would be the fact that there's a back and there's a seat and there's legs. So that would be the kind of the formal cause. And then there's the efficient cause, and this is whoever creates the particular object. So this could be, depending on what you believe in terms of God, parents, or evolution or whatever your beliefs are. That would be the cause of the human, and the cause of the chair would be the carpenter. And then finally, we've the final cause, and this is the purpose. And Aristotle talked a lot about living for your purpose, finding out what your purpose is and living according to your purpose. And he said, a chair's purpose is to be sat upon, a human's purpose is to be and to exist. So by looking at the four causes, it allows us to be able to understand things in a deeper way than normal. And while it might seem on the surface, oh, that's interesting, it actually is incredibly profound and very, very powerful when you start to examine different concepts in that way. Some of the misunderstandings about Aristotle include that a lot of people just see him as a philosopher, but actually he was a scientist and a biologist as well. He found some fascinating things in his work as a biologist, really, really amazing discoveries. He really was a polymath in many different ways. He got plenty wrong as well as a lot right. So a lot of us think, Aristotle, he was a legend, he was so smart, and he was, but he also had a lot of lunatic ideas as well. He and Plato, although they disagreed, they agreed on a lot as well. I mean, we just focus on the whole battle of the theory of forms versus objectivity. But while they had disagreements about different things, fundamentally, Aristotle spent 20 years learning from Plato. So he definitely had a lot of overlap and a lot of ways in which he agreed with Plato. And while he supported democracy, he wasn't like a complete fan of all types of democracy. He knew some of the warnings by Plato and Socrates. He knew what the problems potentially could be. And indeed, he got in a little bit of trouble in Athens, and he left Athens, decided to leave Athens instead of being put to death. And the way he described it was, I'm not going to let you make the same mistake you made years ago with Socrates and with me as well. So he left Athens and stuff and said it was because he didn't want Athens to make the same mistake twice. And again, it just shows you get a bunch of people together. You don't know what they're going to think. They literally murdered Socrates. They sentenced Socrates to death, and they were probably going to do the same to Aristotle. I mean, what gets over people? It's almost like when people turn around and they're smart, it's like that's a mark against them. Like, give me a break. Now, by the way, Aristotle had his flaws, loads of flaws. And just so you know, Plato had loads of flaws. Socrates had loads of flaws. These were, they're very flawed characters, all of them, but still contributed a massive amount to human history and philosophy and the sciences and all sorts of areas of that. But let's talk about a number of practical strategies we can learn, a lot of lessons from Aristotle, which I think are particularly important. First of all, reflecting on your daily actions and decisions. He really talked about the importance of working on yourself and self-improvement in many ways. He was one of the earliest self-improvement aficionados. He talked about the importance of working on yourself, said that things like virtue could be something that you could cultivate and work with. You can form your character by working on it every single day. He talked about applying the golden mean to find balance. So while you're working on yourself, again, it's not just about, I want to be super confident, because again, if you're too confident, then necessarily you're at one extreme. And if you've no confidence, you're at the other extreme. So you just want the right amount, right? The right amount of each, the golden mean. And if you think about it, it's not a million miles away from, in Sweden, they have the concept of lagom, which is, or lagom, which is just enough, right? It's just enough, not too much, right? And in a world where sometimes we can fall into the trap of like more, I want to be the best, I want to be the greatest. Sometimes we can realize that some of the greatest comes about because people are more moderate in the way in which they are. He also talked about living according to your personal telos, which is your purpose, and how important that is. So make sure you're aware of what is your mission, what is your purpose, and living in accordance to that. I think that's a really important point as well. So often we're trying to find ourselves, or why are we here? And Viktor Frankl, in his book Man's Search for Meaning, he talks about the importance of finding meaning in your life. In many ways, this is not a million miles away from that. It's like finding a purpose. What are you here to do? Just like that final cause, the purpose is important for us to fulfill. What is your ultimate purpose in your life? It's an important question to answer. He also looked at striving for excellence without chasing perfection. So once again, the moderation of trying to become excellent by, again, working on yourself, but not trying to make it too perfect, because perfection is impossible. Avoid extremes in judgment. So try to make it so that you're more temperate in your ways of judging the world. Recognize that you have to be able to accept that things won't always be perfect and people won't always act perfectly either. So it's important for us to be able to be more mindful of that. Consider long-term consequences before acting. So try to be a bit more strategic. Again, a lot of the Aristotle work was about logic and thinking through, if A, then B. And being able to recognize that for us to be able to be as effective as possible, we need to put more thought into things. So even his notion of ethos, logos, and pathos means we need to prepare more strategically to be more persuasive. So we don't want to fall into the trap where we just respond in the moment trying to be persuasive. If you look at what the sophists did 100 years before Aristotle, they were notorious for being able to take any argument and convince people of whatever it is that they were saying. Aristotle not only identified how they did what they did, but also talked about the reason it was successful was also because of their charm. The reason it was successful was because they cultivated the ethos, because they leveraged the pathos, and they were also able to use the logos, which made them sound more logical or sound more reasonable than they actually were. So it's imperative to recognize that he was very much about what are the strategic skills that we need to develop. In many ways, he was offering the suggestion that says we need to think long term about this and how do we build up and start to construct the kind of communication that will get the results that we want. And then finally, observe nature to understand patterns of success. Observing and noticing what you see in the world will help you to be able to do better. In many ways, that's what Aristotle did to come up with poetics and to come up with rhetoric, was he was able to study what makes stories work. He was able to study what makes persuasive efforts work. And that's why Aristotle is one of the greatest thinkers of all time. It's because he wasn't just content with thinking through ideas or conceptualizing ideas, but he was able to borrow from the work that he'd learned from Plato and Plato's description of Socrates. So everything from the wonderful questioning approach that Socrates used in sort of an inductive form of reasoning, all the way through to Plato's work, where Plato would start to explore the concept of this cave where we lived in, where reality is not the same as we think it is. And Aristotle took that one bit further and started to go, how can I start to understand to the best of my ability how we think and why we think the way we do? And so we owe a massive amount to Aristotle and the lessons that we have learned from him. Aristotle obviously had his disagreements with Plato, but fundamentally, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle overall have delivered so many wonderful ideas that we can use to be able to transform the way in which we think. And while some of these ideas might sound to us as being, oh, yeah, well, that's obvious. It wasn't obvious 2,400 years ago. In fact, it was information and messages and ideas that helped set the agenda for what was to come. Ideas like this that last more than 2,000 years and still to this day become extremely valuable and useful are the very things that can help us to be able to change our lives and to be able to impact other people too. So highly recommend and go back, check out the wonderful lessons of Aristotle, check out his wonderful book, Rhetoric, check out the amazing work, Poetics, dive deep into the work of how stories work and how persuasion works, and look at the rest of his stuff as well. The guy's a legend and full of wonderful wisdom that is still true so many years after. So I hope you found this useful. I hope you've enjoyed this trip back with me into ancient Greece to explore the work of Plato, Aristotle, and Socrates over the last 3 episodes of the Changing Minds podcast. For now, please do subscribe to the channel. Please do like, please do share, maybe comment and tell me your favorite part of the episode. But for now, take care, be well. May the force be with you as always. And may Aristotle's lessons and teachings help you to improve the quality of your life. Thanks very much for watching. I'm Owen Fitzpatrick. Bye-bye.